Hello everybody and welcome to this Azure Back to School session. My name is Ryan Mangan and today we're going to be talking about the impact of not sizing the selected virtual machine for Azure Virtual Desktop. So let's get started. So just a brief disclaimer before we start. So just a little bit of information about myself. So my name is Ryan. I am the CTO for AppCure, which is an application packaging delivery tool or vendor based out of the United Kingdom. And the kind of large area of my career and focus is on end user computing, delivering both desktops, application delivery of various different things within inside the EUC space. If you want to know more about me, visit my blog, ryanmangansitblog.com. You can also get me at Ryan Mangan on Twitter and my LinkedIn, which is RyanMangan01. So before we start the session today, I just wanted to kind of let you know about an offer that's currently going on for the book publisher. So there's two elements to this. So unfortunately, everybody in Europe and outside of US, there's a code AVD220, which gives you 20% off, and that's from the 30th of August to September the 2022, so the 30th of September to 2022. And then there's also for everybody in the US under Amazon.com, or anybody who has access to Amazon.com, you can access a discount 25% using the 25 AVD code. I don't know how it works. It's publisher, but I think it's something to do with how Amazon works in the different countries. I think you can only have one region for Amazon. Anyway, long story short, as a discount if you want to get a copy of the book. QR code for the book's there as well, and you can find it on any Amazon and the packet publishing store as well. Anyway, that's enough said about that. So in this session, we're going to be talking about the image, users access in a session host, the performance, and some of the challenges associated. I'm going to give a little bit of an industry update as well with what's going on with optimization tools, because there were community tools out there and now they've been made private, commercial, really for the vendor specifically, which is a little bit disappointing. But I'll tell you what you can and can't do and what you can optimize with Azure Virtual Desktop. So before we do that, like most of my sessions these days, they start with the introduction to cloud economics, just to kind of set the scene really for why people are moving to the cloud, why people want Azure Virtual Desktop, and why people are not spending lots of money on tin building their own data centers anymore. Well, essentially, first thing is on-premises has a large capital spend most of the time when you're building infrastructure. There's data centers, cooling costs, it's an expensive ordeal. If I was to tell you that you can pay for what you consume, and from a grand scheme of things that you can reduce the initial spend by 600%, 800%, maybe 2000%, then it would be a no-brainer. And the interesting thing with the introduction to cloud is that the model of pay as you consume, so only consume what you use, and that's been quite useful for organizations, particularly like, for example, like COVID, when factories shut down due to infections, manufacturing across the world globally, things slowed down. It was very difficult to get out of laptops, hardware, and so on and so forth. So by leveraging cloud, which allows you to spin things up, via a web browser, effectively that kind of alleviated the pressures, and what could be done in months could be done in minutes, hours, and days. The other challenge with on-premises workloads, I apologize, is that most of the resources are idle and predictable. What that means is you'll go and spend a lot of money on hardware and you'll only be using 20 to 30% of that resource at all times, which means there's a residual there which you're not using and you've paid for. So it's, costs you money. Even with unpredictable workloads, unpredictable can be a challenge as well, because it's very hard for you to scale. You've got to go out and buy more equipment, but then the unpredictable workload might drop off the cliff again. So you have all of this stuff going on, which is hard to manage and control because it's on premises and there's a capital cost associated with that. Whereas cloud, you can scale up and scale down depending on peaks and troughs of of what's going on at that current time of day, which gives you that flexibility. And a really good example of cloud economics in play is during the COVID pandemic, when people were using online shopping as a key tool to do their day-to-day weekly food shops. And I find this quite interesting because, some organizations which built their systems on premises were having these paywall systems, which were preventing so many users to load because they didn't have the capacity to handle so many connections at one time. But then you also had other organizations that didn't have that because they were scaling out using the likes of cloud technologies and Kubernetes type systems, which just kept scaling and scaling as the requirement grew, which is always quite useful. And during this session, we're going to be talking about cloud economics from a cost-saving, cost optimization perspective as well, which will build on why it's much better to go down the cloud route than it would be to remain on premises for the majority of your services and systems. And this is a really good question, kind of keeping in mind is, can we just deploy an AVD environment without any negative customer consequences? So can we just go ahead and build it without any real kind of testing? Are we just going to grab some random SKUs and deploy it? And the truth of it is, no. And the other thing as well is you can't take a previous deployment from one customer and expect the result to be the same. Someone was once said to be one of the definitions of insanity is repeating the same process, expecting the same result every time. Isn't going to happen. So one of the big focuses within the cloud, well, everybody talks about that you can save all this money in the cloud, but then you've also got the cost. Because it is on consumption, it's hard to ensure that you focus on keeping that cost at a reasonable level and you anticipate what any future changes of that cost would be. And a lot of organizations are looking quite hard because if you don't manage cloud and you don't keep on top of cost optimization, you could actually have some big bills. And it's important for you to kind of focus and stay on top of. But then when we're looking at clients and we're looking at rolling out these projects and rolling out the solutions, we look at the kind of four, and kind of simplify this to be fair, four kind of things: client needs, requirements, designs, and implementation. But then at the testing side of it, you've got acceptance testing. Does it meet the requirements of the client? System testing, does it meet the actual system requirements and specification required? The design, does the design meet the integration testing? And then implementation, is the implementation tested as well? So there's these kind of areas which we need to look at when we're testing that. But this is having the great designs, brilliant, having all of this covered. But sometimes it's nothing to do with this. It's to do with understanding the right size, the right optimizations applied to that particular template operating system image to ensure you get best bang for buck and performance. And we're going to come into cover some of these things off shortly regarding CPUs and some of the research and stuff I've carried out over the years with Azure Virtual Desktop and the performance, etc. And we talk about cloud predictability on premises versus cloud. And we let's just kind of reiterate through a few of these things. So resource contention. Resource contention in the cloud is also particularly challenging if you don't size and you can't scale correctly, because you don't get an exact, it's not the same result each time. Because it's cloud, because it's a pool of resources, it's public cloud, you don't get a dedicated, unless you specify that, set of resources. So when you stop and deallocate a virtual machine, the likelihood it'll be on the same host again is very unlikely. We have no control over Azure backend. That's taken care of by Microsoft. So as to my previous point, you would not be able to kind of control the CPU, the architecture, and the VM host it's running on. You just get a VM at the end of the day, IaaS in Azure. And from the research which we're going to talk about during this session, the performance per VM will differ slightly. I've had to average my results because every single result was different. And we're talking about AMD today and Intel, the differences between them, and obviously what I would recommend when you are deploying or sizing and the architecture of the chipset you should be using for your CPUs. And then obviously these cloud fastest on premises or a desktop virtual machine. And that's a real good debate which probably can continue after this session for people on the differences in performance and specification. And then IOPS and disk. Does disk and IOPS matter? And the short answer is yes, but let's explore that too. So the question we've got is, why is sizing so important? Well, on a personal desktop where it's just one person, sizing, you can kind of roughly work out how much RAM and CPU that user is going to use. But when you're adding multi-session, each person may have a different persona, may have a different way of working, may do different things on the desktop at that time. So someone might have 500 Google or Microsoft Edge browser sessions open, someone will have a lot of different Excel spreadsheets open. The behaviors are different per particular user. And what does that behavior mean to the desktop, the session host itself? Well, it could have an adverse effect if the performance and the scoping isn't right, or that the users are not grouped accordingly. So, if you start impacting CPU over 70-80%, you'll see a knock-on performance impact on everything. It'll just starts causing trouble with RAM and disk as well, because obviously sending requests, they all communicate with each other to a certain extent, and they all need to be able to function correctly. So if there's any kind of onerous or arduous pressures on these components, then you'll start seeing degradation of service. Cost management, can you get better performance for the same amount of money you're paying? Good question. The short answer is yes, you can, but let's have a look at this. A burstable virtual machine's a viable option. Burstable is based on you get so much resource released a period of time based on obviously how much you've consumed. So in a virtual desktop environment with multi-session or unpredictable users or users which are interchanging different users on the same session host, burstable is not a great idea because very quickly you could consume all the burstable resource, which then puts you on a degraded service because there's no resources and you have to wait for them burstable resources to reallocate. And then, premium disks and other disks, what's the differences? We're going to talk about them. We're going to dive into that in a little bit more detail. And Ferial disks and premium standard SSD. We'll talk about auto-scaling as well, where you can scale up, scale down, and the benefits of that. So small versus large virtual machines. Do we scale up or scale out? Well, I was surprised recently because Microsoft's recommendation is to spin up lots of little virtual machines or smaller virtual machines and scale out and then have lesser number of users on the VMs. And to be fair, I think they've got it right. I think that is the best way to kind of deliver an AVD or a VDI environment in the cloud. And that's because you can kind of control the resource. You've got more hosts, you've got people split out, and it's a lot easier to kind of migrate people over or log them off in the event of an issue, etc. And other vendors have suggested that you just have some really big VMs and reduce them down. But the truth of it is, you do not get the same performance benefits as you would do having lots of little or smaller virtual machines. So in this, my view is stick with Microsoft's recommendation, have lots of smaller VMs, scale out rather than larger. Also, if you have a problem with one of them hosts, you've just lost half your environment. It's not a clever move. Even if you're trying to be clever with pricing and trying to get more bang for buck, as we call it, you're still not going to achieve that utopia you're after by having just a couple of virtual machines which are incredibly large. And it also, from some of the calculations I've done, if you size correctly and you scale out the smaller size in a careful way, you potentially would have a lesser cost than you would do having two big, massive, beefy machines. Yeah, so that's an interesting debate for people to kind of discuss, but hopefully people will see my point. The view small is better, as well as Microsoft's on the same kind of side as me. So as I've said, Microsoft recommends that you should always use the smaller VMs and scale out based on requirements. Scale up and scale down is what they do with the auto scale. We've obviously mentioned other vendors suggest otherwise because of a cost price point, but in the Microsoft Azure platform, I wouldn't recommend that. And then obviously my thoughts and feedback from testing in the real world is unpredictable. Eggs in one basket with a smaller number of virtual machines, and the cost for the larger VMs can go into the thousands each month, which doesn't really make great sense. RAM, how critical is it? Well, it depends on your users. Again, understanding your user types. This is why assessment, as I say in all my sessions, is important. It's the first thing you do when you look at deploying an AVD environment. You need to look at the users and the assessment. So Excel, depending on what the user's doing with it, it can be a small Excel file, it could be a large Excel file, and that could potentially have consequences to RAM usage. Some users I have seen in the past have had consumed 8 gigs of RAM themselves, and then you need to kind of combat this. You can use thread locking technology to control that, but obviously these power users may need to just be put on their own desktops in the grand scheme of things. And then baseline application testing to understand load generated by a typical user. Everybody thinks it's great that you install Microsoft Office on the base operating system and it all works great, but when you start putting applications on which may be IOPS hungry, will that IOPS provision to that session host be adequate for that application to run and for all them users using that application or applications work correctly? And the answer is on this, probably not. This is why you need to kind of have a really strong baseline, understand what the minimum resourcing is required for them particular bunches of users. And a really good tool for that is Lakeside Systrack, if you've not used that tool before. You know, configuring a page file, so going back to the physical on-premises days, page file is a good option for kind of, if you get high RAM utilization, you can offload to page file. Some people are probably balking, going, not a good idea, but it's a buffer at least. So are the disks really important? Well, I kind of alluded to that already. You know, applications are the driving force of the operating system. That's what people use. You know, they use applications. They don't just look at the pretty wallpaper. So you need to make sure that you have enough IOPS on that operating system to cater for a good end user experience. And then inferior disks are great and a good choice, and they're free. However, there's a little bit of fiddliness you're going to do to kind of get them working unless using a third-party tool. Also, if you've got an IOPS hungry application, your performance may still be poor, and from the testing I've carried out, that can be the case. And premium disks are great, however, there's a cost associated. Again, though, using third-party tooling, you can mitigate premium disk costs when you're scaling up and scaling down, because some of these clever technologies out there today will flip the premium disk to a standard disk while the VM's off, which means you are not paying for that cost during its off period. And then offloading applications to file storage, Azure files using AppAttach, MSX AppAttach that is, and app file containers. So the ability to basically sideload or attach these applications from centralized storage, which means the IOPS and stuff will be pulled from that storage rather than the local disk of the session host. And then it's a balance. You know, every application is different. The requirements are different for each application. So you need to understand, you know, the IOPS required for that particular deployment. And as you can see here, different size disks and different size provisioned IOPS you can get when you're looking at the size and performance of a virtual machine in Microsoft Azure. You know, if we're looking here at some of them, you're talking, you might need, you know, 5,000 IOPS for particular applications based on the number of users that's in that host. You know, that's a 1 terabyte premium disk, and that's not going to be cheap. It's all about the balance, basically, you know, apps versus resources. And the other question is, you know, would it be better to do remote apps for some of these applications than it would be to kind of do full-blown desktops to kind of reduce resource costings? Lots of things you need to think about and consider when you are when you're planning or testing to do a new rollout. So optimization, and we'll get to the results at the end of this session. Optimization is an interesting concept. What does it mean by optimizing an operating system? What are we talking about here? Performance versus condensed consolidation, more bang for buck. Well, when we optimize, or the term in an AVD or an EUC workspace, VDI workspace, is where you basically optimizing, turning off certain functions of the operating system to improve performance because they are not required for that particular host. By turning off these things can impact the UI, can impact some of the animation and experience of the operating system, and that's something to be aware of. You know, does it improve performance? That is a question which we can cover later on today. And does it allow us to add more users onto that host? And there's some interesting questions for us to kind of come back to. But performance versus condensed consolidation and more bang for buck. You then got performance equals UX experience. Do we lose some of the user experience? And that's something else we're going to cover. And what does that mean? And then you're looking at condensed consolidation, you know, more users per box. By turning off services, we can get more people on there. Is that true? Is that false? What does it mean in reality? And what does that mean for the experience for the users? So when we look at optimization in a great deal, what we can see here is that before we've got 122 processes running, and we've got quite a large number of threads and a lot of handles. You can see there. The utilization is 1% of running. And then we're going over to this side after optimization. You can see that there's only 100 processes, there's only 981 threads, and the handles are in 32,000 plus rather than 45,000 plus. So optimization has reduced the number of processes and things running, and you can see the utilization of the OS is 1% and not 2. Obviously, that's not a true test because that can fluctuate. However, that's just something to consider. You can also note as well that the memory is down from 32% down to 21% count. So that's quite important statistics going to take on. So optimization of the operating system, turning services off naturally, as it says on the tin, does lower the resource utilization of the operating system. Okay. And this is basically using some of the tools out there today to kind of understand what that means. So what are the differences, optimizations out there? There's quite a few really. There's like the core operating system. On a physical environment, you might consider the power, the hardware, optimizing, by enabling high performance. Do you get more performance with the host, but cost of using electricity? Network, by making customizations to the network and QoS and others, do we get more in performance? RAM, application, CPU, disks, all of these kind of areas are things to consider when you're looking at optimizations. By turning off visual effects, we may improve performance of the underlying operating system, but what is that impact to the user? What does that mean to the user? It's something that you need to factor in and consider, and you're only able to kind of gauge that by testing at a pilot or a UAT stage of saying, here, hi customer, we have option A and option B, which is the preference. However, option B costs slightly more because we can't get as many users on it. So they're the kind of things you should be doing with a customer or users to kind of ensure that you get the optimum decision made or select the correct decision for that particular user or group of users. So sadly, the VMware optimization tool is no longer a fling and available to the community. It's been taken back in as a commercial product, which you can't access unless you have a VMware account and the correct licenses for that. So unfortunately, this was a great tool where you could basically go through, choose all the bits and bats you needed for a template, and then basically deliver them optimize that image, and it was really useful for Azure Virtual Desktop as well. And there was other features as well where you could optimize and do NGen and stuff, but sadly that's now gone. So we have to kind of refer to what's available. However, if you do have VMware license and you're doing AVD with VMware, you can still use it, which is good. And also Citrix have a Citrix optimization tool, which is similar, which you can use on their products. Again, you need to be a Citrix customer to kind of obtain that as well. I know that because I've tried. So AVD Optimization Tool of choice. So there is a Windows Virtual Desktop, should be called Azure Virtual Desktop Optimization Toolkit, which effectively is a list of PowerShell scripts which you can run, which carries out optimizations on that image. This allows you to kind of reduce and turn off services, disable, like remove Windows Media Server, schedule tasks, remove application packages, apexes as it were. All of these things you can do to kind of reduce the burden of the image, and you can download them and run them as a script. If you're doing automatic image building and stuff like that, you can automate the scripting for this and call that and pull and do it automatically. So, from a GUI with VMware to this might not be a bad option for you to kind of to use moving forward. But sadly now there's less community tools out there to optimize the image. So interestingly, here's some testing when I did some assessment of two. So I ran some tests on Microsoft Office on both AMD and Intel before optimization and after optimization. As you can see, clearly marked AMD, which is AS, and DS there. Okay. As you can see, these are the different components which we tested, and they're down the side there as well as scores. So before optimization was 6/5, and you can see there's a slight increase there. Again, before, so straight away we can see that AMD has a higher score than Intel. And as we go down and down and down and down, we can see that AMD wins outright throughout the process. And if you look at the optimized after optimization, you can see that Excel which is usually one of the hungry ones, which process. This is a data processing sample which it ran, achieved the highest score out of all the others. And obviously, the unoptimized was just below that. So from the testing I've carried out, the extensive testing, which is average as well over multiple tests, you can see that AMD offers more performance. And when you optimize and carry out optimization, you can see that you do get more performance for bang for buck, as it were. So it does make sense. Conclusion from that is to carry out optimizations on the image, and it also makes sense to use AMD chipsets over Intel. I don't know why there's a big difference, but the EPYC chips seem to be very, very good for using the productivity tools. I can't get anywhere near on the essentials, which is just like using the operating system. And then we start looking at productivity. The closest to, is Excel, but they're nowhere near. You can't get anywhere near. Apart from this one here, which was 737, and that's after optimization. So it's slightly more on PowerPoint. So Intel was better. Intel was better on PowerPoint. Anyway, so that's just some research I carried out to kind of understand. I'm going to revisit that at the end of the year, in 2022, to kind of see where we're at again, because this may have changed. There may be some improvements to this, but gives you an insight that really, if you're deploying Azure Virtual Desktop, you may want to consider AMD over Intel, and you also want to consider using optimizations to kind of get more bang for buck. The cost and the pain of optimizing is something you need to consider, because it does reduce the user experience, but it is something you should definitely look at considering. And here is a nice little grid of some of the things, the full testing. So what I've done here is I carried out lots of tests on the AS, DS, optimization before and after, and Ferial disks, Windows Server 2022, and Cloud PC. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through these carefully. So out of all the testing, I found that the AMD AS version 4, after optimization, achieved the best results. So the scores, in terms of the higher scores better, achieved the best results significantly. As you can see here and here, it outweighs everybody. Intel is dire compared to the AMD stuff. Absolutely dire. And then when we look at Intel and Ferial, again, it's poor. You look at the Ferial for AMD, it's better, but it doesn't give you the same results of these, which are premium disks. And this is my argument and my point, that this might be free, but depending on what you're doing and the IOPS which are required from the disk, because the CPU and RAM are talking to the disk all the time, we need to know what the requirements of the IOPS are and the performance needed. And you can clearly see premium disk, which has more apps than the Inferior disks, is much higher. So if you want improved best performance, you need to use premium disks. That's a given. But if you want obviously free, you can use Imperial. It's much better than the Intel on AMD, but you still just need to be aware of that. You might be happy with this baseline here. This might be acceptable for you as an organization compared to using Intel. And then we look at Cloud PC. Obviously, this was early days of Cloud PC, so I'm not really going off this as anything kind of critical or urgent. I'm sure this is going to be much higher when I test next time. But obviously, it just kind of gives you an insight of the differences between AVD and the Cloud PC. We've then also got the Windows Server 2022 testing. So Windows Server 2022 allows us to do things like app attach, and has some of the more modern OS stuff in there, and looks a bit like Windows 10. So that's quite useful for us. Well, Windows 10 and Windows 11 is a kind of mixed experience, but you can see here that the basic and productivity are very different. But obviously, Windows Server 2022 clearly doesn't look like a good tool for productivity, as you can see. But yeah, so there's some interesting stats for you. As you can see, AMD wins every time against Intel, but the kind of creme de la creme of the crop is the before and after using premium disks on optimization. And obviously using optimization clearly shows here that you should be using optimized premium AMD EPYC chips. And that's the kind of finding for that. So summary. So Unfortunately, I didn't do a demo today on optimization, which is something I'll pick up at a later date. But I wanted to kind of run through some of the research carried out, some of the stuff I've been doing with that, and also give you some insights and help you more start the thought process of looking at how you can improve the performance of the environment. Some of the research and data I've provided will give you an insight maybe that you can improve just by flipping over. Changing to the AMD chipset has no difference in cost if it's the same SKUs as such. Just you change it to AS from DS. So as you've seen, there is a significant difference. You could be seeing an improvement of 20 to 40% on your users. So definitely worthwhile investigating. Optimizations, it is disappointing that some of these tools which have gone away from the community, but that doesn't mean that I might not write one in the future now that the community ones have disappeared. And that kind of concludes this. But before I kind of close off, what I wanted to say is if you in chapter 9 of the book I wrote, Mastering Azure Virtual Desktop, there's quite a lot of extensive information on creating images, optimization and performance in there, and what you need to do with that. So there's lots of various different bits of useful information, how to optimize the image, some of the tools out there in the industry you can use to kind of achieve that. And obviously today, the tool you should be now using is the Virtual Desktop Optimization Tool, which you can find in GitHub nice and easily, and do all your customizations of what you want from that, and more about optimization and capturing the template image in there. So yeah, so if you want to know more about optimization and have a bit more of a deep dive in it, it's definitely worthwhile checking out the book, Mastering Azure Virtual Desktop, which is packed full of information to help you on your VDI Azure Virtual Desktop journey. And just for those who may have missed it at the beginning of the session, to close off, the Mastering Azure Virtual Desktop QR code there, you can find it on the Packet website or Amazon. If you are going on the Packet website in Europe, use the AVD 220, which will get you 20%, and that's from the 30th of August to the 30th of September. And then if you are in America or other countries which have access to Amazon.com, you can access the 25, which is 25%. I don't make the rules, by the way. AVD code there, which will allow you to access between July the 25th and October the 31st. And if you've got any questions whatsoever and want to speak to me about some of the research I've carried out, some of the work I've done, or want to enter into a joint program or research job task with me, more than happy to kind of have a chat about it. So yeah, Twitter handle is at Ryan Mangan, LinkedIn is Ryan Mangan01. My blog is Ryan Mangan's IT blog, which talks further about this, and also the book LinkedIn page is Mastering Azure Virtual Desktop. I hope this has been insightful. I hope you enjoyed the session. You'll see me at some of the other events throughout the year, and feel free to reach out if you want to have a chat. Have a great day, guys. Thank you very much.